This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a political scientist, a Leibniz DAAD post-doctoral fellow at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin, whose research focuses on the construction of Israeli identity through transgressions and aberrations from it, traitors to the cause, as it were, and how the concept has been shaped and understood in the Israeli discourse. Dr. Hadas Cohen, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for having me here.
So your doctoral dissertation focuses on Tali Fahima, a young woman from an unprivileged background who, during the Palestinian uprising of the last decade, also known as the Second Intifada, was indicted for treason after she swore to, quote, serve as a human shield to protect the life of a Palestinian militant in the West Bank. Why did you choose her as your case study?
My interest in the case of Tali Fahima began when I translated an interview for a British journalist who interviewed her mother, who met with her mother. And I'm a lawyer. I studied in the Hebrew. And what caught my attention was how much the case did not make sense legally. There was basically nothing really that she could be charged with because she was there when the secret document that she was accused of translating reached the hands of Zubeidi and his men in Jenin, and basically some of them knew Hebrew. She had no specialized military knowledge that could help them understand the military document, but nevertheless, she was accused of treason, which later they changed it to assisting to an enemy agent. But it's a sub.
What's really the difference between the two charges?
Well, so treason is one of the only two charges in Israeli law on which somebody could be executed. That there is a death penalty for that. It's only for treason and for assistance for being Nazis or assistance to the Nazis. So, and in fact, no one has ever been executed for treason in Israel. Once before the state was formed, somebody was executed for treason. It was done in haste without proper due process, and the person that was executed was later exonerated. So that was the only case in which someone was executed for treason. And when the trial began, the judge even asked the prosecution.
Tali Fahima's.
Yeah, when Tali Fahima's trial began, the judge even asked the prosecution whether they plan on demanding for the death sentence. So,
but when it comes to Tali Fahima again, what's really the difference between treason and assisting an enemy? Because you say even that doesn't hold water if, as you said, she didn't have any kind of additional knowledge that could assist them, really. Was her only vice that she befriended a Palestinian militant who was bent on killing Israelis?
So let me start by saying that I was not there. So I don't know. And I don't want to say things that I do not know. And what my information is based on is reading interrogation transcripts and court documents that I received from Tali Fahima's lawyer. So from what I have seen, there was not much against her. However, since the Shin Bet, the Israeli Security Service, kept much of the information classified, I don't know what else they had against her. So I have to say that.
Okay, but at the end of the day, she was charged and convicted and
she was charged and convicted, yes. She spent 3 years in jail. And one of the interesting things is what the judge said is that even if she did not know Arabic good enough to translate that to them, even if she didn't have any military background to explain to them what was going on, and even if she didn't explain anything, her duty as a loyal citizen was, one, not to be there, and two, if she was already there and she saw that the military document, the classified military document, reached Zubeidi and his men, she should have immediately reported to the Israeli army. So for that,
Okay, so relatively minor charges at the end of the day.
On the face of it, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if you look at the media discourse at the time and still
Yes.
in the collective memory today, I don't think there are people, Israelis, who are perceived as greater traitors than Tali Fahima. Well,
Yes.
maybe a couple.
Yes, definitely. She's almost, at the time, she was almost equivalent to Vanunu, who basically gave away the atom, the fact that Israel has atomic abilities. And yes, and for me, one of the interesting things is to say what I wrote my dissertation about when I'm talking to Israelis and to see their responses. Even today, people react with such vehement and hatred and this kind of like a knee-jerk reaction of, this woman and, this traitor. And of course she slept with him. And of course she had an affair with him. And the things are really very much tied together.
Mm-hmm. So, again, the reason or perhaps the basis for her being labeled as a traitor is her sympathy for Zubaydi, both personal and ideological.
Yes, I believe that if she would have been a man who would have expressed the same sympathy, the reaction in the media would have been very different. She was accused, and I'm using the word accused purposefully, of sleeping with the enemy, of having a romantic relationship with him. And it was very interesting because she refused to discuss that. And she said, this is beyond the story. Please listen to what I have to say. I went to Jenin and I saw what is going on there. And it's horrible. Kids there have PTSD because of the bombings. And what she was saying, that she was trying to start an after-school computer center there. But none of this was being heard. What came across in the Israeli media, many times including in Haaretz, we didn't have Israel Today.
Yeah, Israel Hayom, the pro-Netanyahu newspaper.
Yes, we didn't have that one then.
But you're saying even in Haaretz because it's relatively left-leaning and liberal.
Yes, more open-minded. Even there, what they did is they kept on saying his partner, his girlfriend, chavira shelo, meaning in Hebrew that means his girlfriend. It's not his platonic friend. And that was something that was very, very difficult to process in the Israeli social imaginary, because one of the biggest taboos in Israel is that Jewish Israeli women would sleep with Arab men, and particularly Muslim Arab men. Mm-hmm. It's one of the most derogatory things that a woman, Jewish Israeli woman, could be accused of. And indeed, there is the frame, I don't know if I can say it, but I will, mizdayanet im Aravim, which means fucking with Arabs. If a Jewish Israeli woman is labeled with that, this is one of the lowest places that she could go, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this sense, perhaps it's kind of a mixture of a political and a feminist critique in your research, because infidelity goes both ways, both to the cause or to the collective, and both ideological and personal in terms of affection.
Yes, and it's very interesting to think what would have happened if a Jewish Israeli man would have had an affair with an Arab Muslim woman, with an Arab Palestinian woman. Of course, that would have been considered as if he was conquering, right? It would have been an act of triumph almost, which in its opposite, if it's the woman is Jewish and the man is Arab. Mm-hmm. So the taboo exists only in one way. You met with Tali Fahima.
Yes. You interviewed her for your research. What is her life story? What took her, a young woman from an underprivileged background, from Kiryat Gat, which is a kind of a run-down development town in the south of Israel. What took her to Jenin, and what triggered her to volunteer to serve as a human shield for Zachariah Zubaydi? So what Tali told me when I met with her is that at the time of the Second Intifada, when the whole story began, she was living in Tel Aviv, experiencing suicide bombings that were happening here almost on a daily basis, and she really wanted to know why they hate us so much. She started going online and chatting with Arabs from the Arab world and to open a conversation. And then one day she read about Zubaydi's story, and I don't know if you know that, but Zubaydi was one of the kids in the theater that Orna Mar had in Jenin. Orna was an actress, and she had a kids' theater in Jenin. A Jewish Israeli one, which yes. And basically what happened is that Zubaydi's mother and brother were killed in one of the battles in Jenin, and that caught Fahima's attention. And she contacted him. They started talking,
And then she decided to visit him. He invited her and she decided to take him up on his offer to see what is going on in Jenin with her own eyes. Mm-hmm. And she told me that when she went there, they had a really normal, nice conversation and a friendship developed. Now, if there was something else that motivated that, again, I don't know. I'm going only by what she told me and what I read.
Did you ask?
No, I didn't really, because I felt it's a little bit like the Inon Magal case.
Uh-huh.
Do we really want to go there? Do I want to make this, let's say they had an affair or not?
It's sort of a sexual harassment on your part.
Exactly, and it would be limiting the story to that. I don't know. Maybe she had an affair, maybe she didn't. I don't think that's relevant.
You don't think it's relevant?
No, I don't think it's relevant. Not at all. Not at all. It's her own personal life. And yes, whom somebody sleeps with is their own choice, has nothing to do with the public. In fact, I think that all of this discussion...
No, but it can affect her political worldview. When you're not taking the sexual intercourse as a technical act, but something that expresses love and affection.
Right. But do I, as a researcher, as a political scientist, is that my role to go and ask that
that's
question?
That's a different question. Okay.
And not only that, I think that in the Israeli media, one of the best ways to depoliticize what Fahima was saying was to say, oh, she's sleeping with him.
I was just going to say, it's my role as a journalist to at least show some interest in that. But of course, the problem with the Israeli media is that they got carried away in the other direction and focused on her presumed love affair rather than what she was actually trying to say.
It neutralizes, right? Because if we say, oh, she had an affair with him, then of course she becomes sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Well, maybe she just went there and saw what's going on in Jenin and it broke her heart, it touched her in some ways. And what is it relevant whether she had an affair and that shaped her political motivations or not?
But still, I mean, she wasn't the only pro-Palestinian or I wouldn't say, well, pro-Palestinian perhaps is an exaggeration
activist
here. The only Israeli female activist who, during the Intifada years, spoke in favor of some sort of end to the hostilities between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Why still in the Israeli discourse did Tali Fahima stand apart as opposed to the female activists in Mahsom Watch, which is also a feminist anti-war organization that monitors checkpoints in the West Bank and is perceived as traitors to the cause as well?
Right. Well, the problem with Tali Fahima's character is that she did not fit any existing category. She's Mizrachit, meaning that she's of Middle Eastern descent. She's of a poor economic background. She didn't go to Tel Aviv University and study Foucault for her BA. No, in fact, she finished her high school exams only after the army, from what I understood. I could be wrong, but I believe that this was the case. And her political consciousness came out of nowhere. So she wasn't like one of these Mahsom Watch activists that are usually Ashkenaziyot, meaning that they come from European descent, middle upper class. Most of them are quite well off economically. She didn't belong to that. And not only that, she was very individualistic and she refused to become one with the peace movement. She was quite marginal with them as well. So she didn't fit anything that existed before.
And do you believe her when she says it was just innocent curiosity that led her to reading and chatting with Arabs? Because, if you ask the average Israeli, why do the Arabs want to kill us? Or engage in suicide bombings, they'll have a very clear answer, and that is that they hate us and want to kill us. End of story. What was it that prompted Tali Fahima to look further?
I don't know. And I think that my role as a scientist is not to decide whether I believe her or not. Right. It is to look at the media coverage, to look at the witch that they made of her. That was they burned her at the stake, metaphorically. That is fascinating. That was fascinating for me. It is my role to look at, as a lawyer, as a legal scholar, it is my role to look at the way the courts handled the case. But whether... Do
you think the courts handled the case properly? I mean, you're very critical of the media coverage of it, and with good reason. But do you think that justice was made?
Well, what is justice? Does justice exist in a world where...
Okay, let me narrow it down a bit for you and ask a more specific question. Do you think that the trial was relatively unaffected by the media storm outside?
That's a very good question. Some of the judges were very objective and were more or less critical of Fahima. Others were, you could see their ideological underpinning and how they talked to Fahima. So some were and some were not. I think that the question is not whether this was a just or a fair trial, because I think that every democratic country has got these holes in which democratic rule disappears. For instance, in Israel, in some instances, it happens when what is going on in the West Bank comes into play. In the United States, it exists with Guantanamo. In Germany, it happens in other instances. So I think it's naive to think that justice will be made when it comes to these cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I want to pass on briefly to your current research, which on the surface looks completely unrelated. Mm-hmm. It focuses on the Israeli community in Berlin, a relatively young and new community that's in the process of being established and therefore perhaps triggers the interest of scholars such as you. But if you look a bit deeper and scratch the surface, there's quite a bit of continuity between the Tali Fahima type traitor and those traitors to the Zionist cause who sometimes defiantly leave Israel and settle in Berlin that only 70 years ago was really the epicenter of the anti-Jew sentiment around the world.
That's interesting. You're not the first one who's saying that, seeing that continuity between my previous research and the current one. What I saw as a continuity is that I wrote before about traitors and treason, and the traitor betrays the home. So now what was interesting for me is to investigate how does a community create a home. It's as if we're talking about two sides of the same coin. And I thought, where would be an interesting place where a community is trying to create a home? It is Berlin, where we have a very complicated, as Jewish Israelis, we have a very complicated relationship with this country, and particularly with Berlin, because walking there, it's a city where nothing is neutral, especially at the beginning. The language itself is difficult to hear at first. Many of my interviewees, the Israelis that live there, told me that. This is something that goes away after a while. But then they describe how the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust exists more in the shadows. And on the one hand, many of them say, oh, it's nothing, we're beyond that. But within 5-minute conversation, they start to say how they do feel it, how it lurks, how it affects their mood sometimes. So that is something that is, again, a complicated place to start a new home.
But why Berlin? I mean, it's not the only Israeli community in stages of formation.
Of course, but in Berlin, the genocide of the people who are moving there, the grandparents of the people who are moving there right now, was planned and should have. And I think it's a historical irony that this is the place that they're moving to right now.
Right. Don't you think that some of them are defiantly marking themselves as traitors to the cause, to the Zionist cause? I mean, because as opposed to other, perhaps earlier waves of Israeli emigration to other places in the world, they are pretty composed about it. They do it with some sort of determination, whereas older generations were ashamed of it and did it out of some sort of lack of choice or perhaps economic rather than ideological calculations.
You mean moving to Berlin or leaving Israel? Leaving Israel. Right. So people who left Israel until the 80s and even the 90s were branded as Yoldim, right? Meaning people who descended. And then that stopped. And it doesn't exist. They're not seen like that by the majority of Israelis. However, people that are leaving to Berlin are seen many times as people who are betraying the history, not necessarily the Zionist cause, but the history, the ancestry, the memory of the Holocaust, and so on. But many of them move there not to be defiant of the Zionist cause or anything of that sort. They're moving there because Berlin is extremely affordable. And I keep on telling people here, everything that you hear is true and even more. Not to mention that it's cosmopolitan. It's a city where people who are academics and artists can afford to live at the center. For instance, I'm renting an apartment in Kreuzberg, and my apartment is located right on the canal, on the Landwehr Canal. And I don't know if anyone has been to Berlin here, but it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. In New York, I could never afford that. In Tel Aviv, I don't think that I could afford that as a postdoc researcher.
And so let's go to the crux of the issue itself. How do they construct a home?
How do they construct? Okay. So one of the interesting things that is happening in Berlin in terms of constructing a home is the debates and the focus on the centrality of the Hebrew language is something that gives them a sense of identity. So I don't know if you know that, but in Berlin at the beginning of the century, there was a lot of publications in Hebrew, a lot of authors, Chaim Nachman Bialik, Lea Goldberg, Shai Agnon, all of them are the forefathers of Hebrew literature, lived there. And what is happening there right now is that there's, first of all, a lot of discussion of this history, but also a lot of academic work that is happening in Hebrew in Berlin. So for instance, on an average week, there are at least 2 or 3 events, academic events, very, how shall I say, high quality, by Israeli scholars that are taking place in Hebrew. And many times there are 50, 60, 70 people in the audience. And there is a lot of thinking and discussions of who we are. What does it mean to be Israelis here? How are we making a renaissance of Hebrew culture? It's not Israeli, but they're defining it as a Hebrew language culture that is going on there. And maybe in that sense, there is a bit of a split from Zionism. But the way I'm thinking about it is that it's
yes and no, because Hebrew, at the end of the day, a central tenet of Zionism is also a central tenet of their activity and their culture.
Yes. And many of them see themselves as Israelis, that Israel is still the home that they miss very much.
Okay, it's a home away from home in a way.
Yes, yes.
All right, Dr. Hadas Cohen, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but thank you very much for coming in. That was very fascinating. I mean, also the evolution and the progress of your research interests and how they all tie together very neatly and very interestingly. So thank you very much for coming in today. You're a political scientist, a Leibniz DAAD postdoctoral fellow at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin, whose research focuses on the construction of Israeli identity via treason, for all that phrase may include. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
I wish that I could see what the hell is wrong with me, but I don't. No, I'm getting there, but it's getting so hard. I guess I should have known the way to let it go, but I don't. No, I'm getting there, and it's breaking your heart.